I'm trying to make it zoom in. Not what I was trying to do. The Forest of Silence. I don't even know if anybody's here. That's okay. Jared stood unnoticed in the crowd thronging the great hall of the palace. He leaned against the marble pillar, blinking with tiredness and confusion. It was midnight. He had been roused from his bed by shouts and bells. He had pulled on his clothes and joined the crowd of noble folk surging towards the hall. "The king is dead," the people were whispering. "The young prince is to be crowned at once." Jared could hardly take it in. The king of Deltora, with his long plaited beard and his golden robes, had died of the mysterious fever that had kept him to his bed for the last few weeks. Never again would his deep, booming voice be heard in the hallways of the palace. Never again would he sit laughing in the feasting hall. King Alton was dead, like his wife, the queen before him. The fever had taken them both. And now Hendon would be alone. He would be the king, Jared thought. He shook his head, trying to make himself believe it. He and Hendon had been friends since they were young children. But what a difference there was between them. For Hendon was the son of the king and queen, the prince of Deltora. And Jared was the son of a trusted servant who had died in the king's service. When Jared was only 4 years old, Jared had been given to Hendon as a companion, so that the young prince would not be lonely. They had grown up together, like brothers. Together they did their lessons in the schoolroom, teased the guards, and persuaded the cooks in the kitchen to give them treats. Together they played in the vast green gardens. The other children who lived in the palace, the sons and daughters of nobles and servants, kept to their own rooms and their own parts of the grounds, as was the palace custom. Jared and Hendon never even saw them, except in the great hall on feast days. But the two boys did what they could to entertain themselves. They had a secret hiding place, a huge hollow tree near the palace gates. There they hid from fussy old men, their nursemaid, and Prandine, the king's chief advisor, a tall, thin, sour man they both disliked. They practiced archery together, playing a game called Aim High, where the first to shoot an arrow into the topmost fork of the hollow tree would win. They invented a secret code and used it to pass messages, jokes, and warnings to each other under the noses of their teachers, Min or Prandine. Jared would be hiding in the hollow tree, for example, because Min wanted him to take a dose of the fish oil medication he detested. Hendon would walk by and drop a note where he could reach it. Del ono o telgel, telo tel, helikel itel, sel helen, nel sel bel, e nelly sel, telhel el rele. The message looked like nonsense, and no one in the palace could guess the meaning, if they picked it up by accident. But the code was simple. All you had to do to decode the message was to write down all the letters in a line, leaving out the EL wherever it happened. What I just read came out to, "Do not go to the kitchen, men is there." And then all you had to do was divide the messages to make sense. As Hendon and Jared grew older, there was less time for games. Their days were filled with tasks and duties. Most of their time was spent learning the rule, the thousands of laws and customs by which the royal family lived. The rule governed their lives. They sat, Endon patiently and Jared not so patiently, while their long hair was plaited and twined with golden cord according to said rule. They spent hours learning to hammer red-hot metal into swords and shields. The first king of Deltora had been a blacksmith, and it was part of the rule that his art should be continued. Also, hello, I see that someone joined. Each late afternoon they had a precious hour of free time. The only thing they were not allowed to do was to climb the high wall that surrounded the palace, or go through the gates to the city beyond. For the Prince of Deltora, like the king and queen, never mingled with ordinary people. This was an important part of the rule. It was a part that Jared was sometimes tempted to break, but Endon, quiet, dutiful, and obedient, anxiously begged him not to even think of climbing walls. "It is forbidden," he would say, "and Prandine already fears that you are a bad influence on me, Jared. He has told my father so. If you break the rule, you will be sent away, and I don't want that." Jared did not want it either. He knew he would miss Endon sorely. And where would he go if he had to leave the palace? It was the only home he had ever known. So he tamed his curiosity about the city beyond, and it remained a mystery to him, as it was to the prince. The sound of crystal trumpets broke into Jared's thoughts. He turned, like everyone else, toward the back of the hall. Endon was entering between two rows of royal guards in pale blue uniforms trimmed with gold. Endon. Poor Endon, Jared thought. He's grieving. He wished that he could be beside his friend to comfort him, but he had not been summoned. Instead, Prandine stalked at Endon's right hand. Jared looked at Prandine with dislike. The advisor looked even taller and thinner than usual. He wore a long purple robe and carried what looked like a box covered by a gold cloth. As he walked, his head poked forward so that he looked like a great bird of prey. Endon's eyes were shadowed with sadness, and he looked so small and pale in his stiff silver jacket. With his high jeweled collar, but he held up his head bravely, as he'd been taught to do. All his life he'd been trained for this moment. "When I die, you will be king, my son," his father had told him so many times. "Do not fail in your duty." "I will not fail, father," Endon would answer him obediently. "I will do what is right when the time comes." But neither Jared nor Endon had thought the time would come so soon. The king was so strong and healthy that it seemed like he would live forever. Endon had reached the front of the hall now, and the mounting steps to the platform. When he had reached the top and faced the sea of faces, "He's so young," a woman near Jared breathed to her neighbor. "Shh," the neighbor warned. "He is the rightful heir." As she spoke, she glanced nervously in Jared's direction. Jared did not recognize her face, but he realized she knew him and feared he might tell Endon that her friend had been disloyal. He looked away quickly. But now, the crystal trumpets were sounding again, and a low, excited murmuring had begun in the crowd. Prandine had put his burden down on a small table beside the throne. He was sweeping the gold cloth aside to reveal a glass box. He was opening the box and taking out something that shone and glittered. The magic belt of Deltora. The crowd gave a hissing sigh, and Jared, too, caught his breath. He had heard about the belt since his earliest childhood, but he'd never seen it before. And yet, here it was, in all its beauty and mystery. The ancient object that for thousands of years had kept Deltora safe from an invasion by the evil Shadow Lord who ruled the mountains. Hanging between Prandine's bony fingers, the belt seemed as delicate as lace, and the 7 huge gems that sat along its length looked like beautiful decorations. But Jared knew the belt was made of the strongest steel, and that each of the gems played its own special part in the magic that protected the Deltora. There was the topaz, the symbol of faithfulness, gold as the setting sun. There was the amethyst, symbol of truth, purple as the violets that grew by the banks of the river Dell. For purity and strength, there was the diamond, clear and sparkling as ice. For honor, there was the emerald, green as lush grass. There was the lapis lazuli, the heavenly stone, midnight blue with pinpoints of silver like the night sky. There was the ruby for happiness, red as blood, and the opal, a symbol of hope, sparkling with all the colors of the rainbow. The crowd seemed to hold its breath as Prandine bent to loop the belt around his waist. The advisor's fingers fumbled with the fastening, and he was standing well back. He almost seems afraid, Jared thought curiously. I wonder why. Then suddenly, the fastening snapped closed, and his questions were answered. Prandine sprang backwards. There was a crackling sound, and at the same moment, the belt seemed to explode with light. The gems blazed like fire, lighting the hall with their rainbow brilliance. The people cried out and turned away, hiding their eyes. Endon stood with his arms upraised, almost hidden by the flashing, darting light. No longer was he just a young boy with sad eyes. The magic belt had recognized him as the true heir to the throne of deltora. He, and he alone, could now use its mystery, magic, and power. But will Endon use them? Jared thought suddenly. Did his father use them? Did his father do anything but follow the rules laid down ages ago? He watched as the fires of the gems slowly died into a winking glow. He watched as the young king took off the belt and handed it back to Prandine. He watched as Prandine, now smiling, put it back in its glass case. Jared knew what would happen to the belt now. As the rules stated, it would be carried back to the topmost room of the palace tower. The door of the room would be locked with 3 gold locks. 3 guards in gold uniforms would be put outside the door. And then life would go on as before. Prandine and the other government officials would make all the real decisions affecting the kingdom. The king would simply attend ceremonies and feasts and laugh at the clowns and acrobats in the great hall, practice archery and the blacksmith's art. He'd sit for hours while his hair, and one day his beard, were plaited. He would sign endless documents and stamp them with a ring that bore the royal seal. He would simply follow the rule. In a few years, he'd marry a young woman chosen for him by Prandine, a daughter of one of the noble families who had spent her life inside the palace walls. They'd have a child to take Endon's place when he died, and that child would also wear the belt only once, before it again was locked away. And now, for the first time in his life, Jared wondered if it was a good idea. For the first time, he wondered how and why the belt was made. For the first time, he began to doubt the wisdom of letting such a power for good remain idle in a tower room, while the realm it was supposed to protect lay unseen outside the high walls. He slipped unnoticed out of the great hall and ran up the stairs to the palace library. This was another first for him. He'd never loved to study. But there were things he simply needed to know, and the library was the only place he was likely to find them out. After hours of searching, Jared finally found a book that he thought might help him. It was covered in a faded blue cloth and gold lettering on the outside. It had been worn away, but the inside title was still very clear. The Belt of Deltora, its history, its power, and its magic. The book was nothing like the splendid hand-painted volumes that he and Endon read in the schoolroom, and nothing like the many other weighty books on the library shelves. It was small, thin, and very dusty. It had been tucked away in the library's darkest corner among piles of papers, as though somebody had wanted it forgotten. Jared carried the old book carefully to a table, beginning to read it from beginning to end. His task might take him all night, but he did not expect to be disturbed. No one would be looking for him, and it would go straight from the great hall to the chapel, where his father's body would lay surrounded by candles. He'd keep watch there alone till dawn, following the rule. TikTok universe. What? I don't know what that said. I glanced over at the wrong time. Where was I? Poor Endon, thought Jared. It has only been a few days since he did the same for his mother. Now he is alone in the world, as am I. But at least we will have each other. We're friends to the death, and I will protect him as best I can. Protect him from what? The question pierced his mind like a sharp knife. Why had he suddenly begun to fear for Endon? Who or what could threaten the all-powerful king of deltora? I'm tired, he thought, of imagining things. He shook his head impatiently and lit a fresh candle to brighten the darkness. But the memory of Prandine's thin smile as he locked on the magic belt kept drifting in his mind, like the shadow of a remembered nightmare. He frowned and lowered his head to the book, turned to the first page, and began to read. In the ancient days, deltora was divided into 7 tribes. The tribes fought on their borders, but otherwise stayed in their own place. Each had a gem from deep within the earth, a talisman with special powers. There came a time when the enemy from the Shadowlands cast greedy eyes upon deltora. The tribes were divided, and singly, none of them could repel the invader, who had begun to triumph. A hero called Aden rose from the ranks of the people. He was but an ordinary man, a blacksmith who made swords and armors and shoes for horses. But he had been blessed with strength, courage, and cleverness. One night, Aden dreamed of a special splendid belt, 7 steel medallions beaten to the thinness of silk and connected together with a fine chain. To each medallion was fixed one of the tribal gems. Realizing that the dream had been sent to him for a purpose, Aden worked in secret over many months to create a likeness of the belt he'd been shown. Then he traveled around the kingdom to persuade each tribe to allow its talisman to be added. The tribes were at first very suspicious and very wary. One by one, desperate to save their land, they agreed. As each gem became a part of the belt, the tribe grew stronger. The people kept their strength a secret and bit their time. Oh God, I'm stuttering on my words. And at last, when the belt was complete, Aden fastened it around his waist, and it flashed like the sun. All the tribes united behind him to form a great army, and together they drove the enemy from their land. And so Aden became the first king of the united tribes of deltora, and he ruled the land long and wisely. But he never forgot that he was a man of the people, and their trust in him was the source of his power. Neither did he forget that the enemy, though defeated, was not destroyed. He knew that the enemy was clever and sly, and that in its anger, envy 1,000 years is like a blink of an eye. So he always wore the belt, and never let it out of his sight. Jared read on, and the more he read, the more troubled he became. He had a pencil and some paper in his pocket, but he did not need to take notes. The words of the book seemed to be burning themselves into his brain. He was learning more than he expected, not just about deltora and the belt, but about the rule. The first to leave the belt aside was Aden's grandson, King Elstrad, who in his middle years grew fat with good living and found the steel cut sadly into his belly. Elstrad's chief advisor soothed his fears, saying the belt need only be worn on great occasions. Elstrad's daughter, Queen Adina, followed her father's ways, wearing the belt only 5 times during her reign. Her son, King Brandon, wore it only 3. And last it came to the custom belt to be only worn the day the heir took the throne. At the urging of his chief advisor, King Brandon caused the rallied builders to raise a great palace on the hill, the center of the city of Del. The royal family moved from the old blacksmith's forge to the palace. And over time, it became the custom for them to remain within its walls. No harm could come of them there. When Jared closed the book at last, his heart was heavy. His candle had burned low, and the first dawn of light was showing. He sat for a moment thinking. Then he slipped the book into his shirt and ran to seek Endon. The chapel was below ground level, in a quiet corner of the palace. It was still and cold. The old king's body was lying on the raised marble platform in the center, surrounded by the candles. Endon was kneeling beside it, his head bowed. He looked up as Jared burst in. His eyes were red from weeping. You should not be here, Jared, he whispered. It is against the rule. It is dawn, and I had to see you, Jared panted. Endon stood up swiftly and came over to him. What is it? He asked in a low voice. Jared's head was full of everything he had read. The words came tumbling out of him. Endon, you should wear the belt of deltora always, as the ancient kings and queens did. Endon stared at him in puzzlement. Come, Jared urged, taking his arm. Let us go and get it now. But Endon held back, shaking his head. You know I cannot do that, Jared. Jared stamped his foot with impatience. Forget the rule! It is just a collection of traditions that have grown up over the years and been made a law by the chief advisors. It is dangerous, Endon. Because of it, every new ruler of Deltora has been more powerless than the one before them. This must stop. With you. You must get the belt and put it on. Then you must come with me outside the palace gates. He was speaking too fast and too wildly. By now, Endon was frowning, backing away from him. You are ill, my friend. He was whispering nervously. Or you have been dreaming. No, Jared insisted, following him. It is you who are living in a dream. You must see how things are outside the palace, and the city, and beyond. I see the city, Jared, argued Endon. I look out from the window every day. It's beautiful. But you do not talk to the people. You do not walk among them. Of course I do not. It is forbidden by the rule. Endon gasped. But I know that all is well. You know nothing except for what you were told by Prandine. And is that not enough? The cold voice cut through the air like sharp steel. Startled, Endon and Jared spun around. Prandine was standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Jared, glittering with hatred. How dare you tempt the king to turn from his duty and servant boy? He hissed, striding into the chapel. You have always been jealous for him, and now you seek to destroy him? Traitor! No! Exclaimed Jared. He turned again to Endon. Believe me, he begged. I have only your good at heart. But Endon shrank away from him, horrified. Jared plunged his hand into his shirt to get the book. Show Endon proved to him that he had good reason. Beware, your majesty! He has a knife! Shouted Prandine, leaping forward and sweeping Endon under his cloak as if to protect him. He raised his voice to a shriek. Murderer! Traitor! Guards! Guards! For a single moment Jared stood frozen. Then he heard the bells of warning ringing. He heard shouts of alarms and heavy feet threading through the chapel. He saw Prandine's mocking, triumphant smile. He realized Prandine had been given the chance he'd been waiting for. The chance to rid himself of Jared for good. Jared knew that if he valued his life, he would have to flee. Pushing Brandon aside, he ran like the wind from the chapel. Up the stairs into the back of the palace, he plunged into the huge dim kitchens where the cooks were beginning to light the fires and the great stoves. Behind him, he could hear the shouts of the guards. Traitor! Stop him! Stop him! But the guards did not try to stop, or the cooks did not try to stop Jared. How could they think he was the one the guards were pursuing? He was the young king's friend, and they had known him all his life. They only watched as Jared tore the kitchen door open and ran outside. The grounds were deserted, except for a ragged old man tipping food scraps into a horse-drawn cart. He took no notice as Jared plunged under the cover of the thick bushes that grew beside the palace walls. Keeping low, Jared crawled through the bushes at the front of the palace. Then he ran, dodging and weaving, till he reached the tree near the gates, where so often he and Endon had hid from men in the old days. He crept into the tree's hollow and huddled there, panting. He knew the guards would surely find him in the end. Perhaps Endon would even tell them where to look. When they found him, they would kill him. Of that he had no doubt. He cursed himself for being impatient, for scaring Endon with wild talk while he was still confused, tired, and grieving, for playing into Prandine's hands. There was a squeaking, rattling sound not far away. Peering cautiously out of his hollow, Jared saw the rubbish cart trundling around the side of the palace, heading for the gates. The old man sat at the front, urging his tired horse on with sad shakes of the reins. Jared's heart leapt. Perhaps there was a chance of escape within the palace after all. But how could he run away, leaving Endon alone and unprotected? He was sure now that Prandine was evil. If you stay, you will die, and then you'll never be able to help it. Never. The thought sent him to his knees, and he pulled out a pencil paper and scrawled out. Efel ya yel on unel I edel mel imer lehel igel hel aned del I weli li se el ome. He tucked the note in the hole of the tree's trunk, wondering if his friends would ever see it, perhaps then believing what Brandy had said of him would never come out to be. But he had done what he could, and the cart was coming closer. Soon it would pass under the tree, and that would be his chance. As he had done so many times before, he climbed up to the hollow trunk of the tree. And squeezed out of the hole that gaped just above its lowest branch. From here he could see that there were guards everywhere, but he was used to hiding. He lay on his stomach, flattening himself against the branch, being careful not to make it sway. The rubbish cart was underneath him now. He waited till it was just the right moment, then dropped lightly onto the back, burrowing quickly into the sticky mess of scraps until he was completely covered. Bread crust, apple peel, moldy cheese, gnawed bones, and half-eaten cakes pressed against his face. The smell nearly made him choke. He screwed his eyes shut and held his breath. He could hear the sound of the horse's feet. He could hear the distant shouting of the guards searching for him. At last he could hear the sound of the first pair of wooden gates creaking open. His heart thudded as the cart trundled on. Then he heard the gates closing behind him, and the second pair of gates opening. Soon, soon. The cart moved on, swaying and jolting. With a creak, the second pair of gates slammed shut, and then Jared knew for the first time in his life he was outside the palace walls. The cart was trundling down the hill now. Soon he would actually be in the beautiful city he'd so often seen from his window. He had to look. His curiosity was too great. Slowly he wriggled until his eyes and nose were above the scraps. He was facing back towards the palace. He could see the walls and the gates. He could see the top of the hollow, but Jared squinted in puzzlement. Why couldn't he not see the terrace of the palace, or the tops of the other trees in the garden? Above the wall there was only shining mist. He thought his eyes were at fault and rubbed them, but the mist did not disappear. Confused, he turned his head and looked towards the city, and his shock, dismay, and horror was so great that he almost cried out. For instead of beauty, he saw ruin. The fine buildings were crumbling, the roads were filled with holes, the grain fields were brown and choked with weeds, the trees were stunted and bent. Waiting at the bottom of the hill was a crowd of thin, ragged people carrying baskets and bags. Jared began struggling to free himself from the rubbish. In this confusion, he no longer cared if the driver of the cart heard him or not, but the old man did not look around. Jared realized that he was deaf, unable to speak too, no doubt, for he had not uttered a single word, even to the horse. Jared leapt from the back of the cart and rolled into the ditch on the side of the road. He lay, watching as the cart moved to the bottom of the hill and stopped. The old man sat staring ahead of him, while the ragged people swarmed in the pile of rubbish. Jared saw them fighting one another for the scraps from the palace tables, stuffing old bones, crust, vegetable peelings into their baskets and into their mouths. They were starving. Sick at heart, Jared looked back into the palace. From here, he could just see the tips of the palace turrets rising above the shimmering mist. Endon might be looking from his window at this moment, staring down at the city. He would be seeing a place of peace, beauty, and plenty. He would be seeing a lie created by pictures on a misty screen. How many years this evil magic blinded the eyes of the kings and queens of Deltora? Who had created it? Words from the book came to Jared's mind. He shuddered with dread. The enemy is clever, sly, and to its anger and envy 1,000 years is like the blink of an eye. The shadow lord is stirring. Alright, at that, I'm going to end the stream, and I will be doing it again in a couple days. Thank you for anyone who's been watching.